Imagine discovering that your mind is not just unique. It's a weapon so powerful that it can shatter the consciousness of beings who have mastered telepathy for millennia. What happens when humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology, our determination, or our ability to survive impossible odds, but something far more terrifying: the chaotic, untamed wilderness of human thought itself? In the depths of space, where ancient civilizations have built empires on the foundation of mental harmony and telepathic connection, one species stands apart. Not because they lack the ability to touch minds, but because their minds are storms of such intensity that they can break even the most skilled psychic contact. This is the story of first contact gone wrong in the most unexpected way possible. When a galaxy's most powerful telepath reaches out to touch a human mind for the first time, the result will shake the very foundations of how the universe understands consciousness, power, and what it truly means to be human. Get ready for a journey that explores the terrifying beauty of the human psyche and why sometimes our greatest strength lies not in what we can control, but in what we absolutely cannot. The crystalline spires of New Mentera gleamed like frozen thought against the amber sky of Kepler 442b. High telepath Zephyrian stood at the center of the Grand Communion Chamber, his elongated form perfectly still as waves of psychic energy flowed through his consciousness like rivers of liquid starlight. Around him, the Council of Minds maintained their mental link, creating a web of shared awareness that had governed their civilization for over 3,000 years. Today marked a historic moment, the first contact with a species that called themselves humans. Zephyrian's silver eyes, large and luminescent, reflected the concern rippling through the collective consciousness. The humans had arrived in their crude metal vessels 6 months ago, broadcasting primitive electromagnetic signals that scratched against the mental atmosphere like fingernails on crystal. Unlike every other spacefaring species the Mentari had encountered, these beings seemed completely closed off from the psychic plane. They were mental voids, walking shadows in a universe of interconnected consciousness. The approach vectors are confirmed, reported subtelepath Lyrian through the mind link, her thoughts tasting of calculated precision. The human delegation consists of 5 individuals. Their ship maintains position at the designated coordinates. The other council members shifted uneasily, their mental voices creating a discordant symphony of worry. First speaker Valerian, ancient and wise, projected his thoughts with the weight of centuries. In all our expansion across the galaxy, we have never encountered minds so completely sealed. Every species, from the gas-dwelling ethereals of Proxima to the silicon-based crystallites of Wolf 359, shares the gift of mental connection. These humans are anomalous. Zephyrian nodded, his own thoughts carefully controlled despite the growing unease in his core. As the most powerful telepath in Mentari history, he had been chosen to attempt first mental contact. His abilities had successfully bridged communication gaps with dozens of alien species, creating the foundation for the vast psychic network that connected half the galaxy. If anyone could reach into the apparently empty minds of these humans, it would be him. The preparation chamber hummed with bioluminescent energy as Zephyrian settled into the contact throne, an ancient artifact designed to amplify telepathic abilities beyond normal limits. Crystalline conduits extended from the chair like metallic nerves, connecting to nodes placed strategically around his head and neck. The device had been created by the first Mentari telepaths, designed to facilitate communication across the vast emptiness of space. Remember, first speaker Valorian's mental voice carried paternal concern. These beings may not understand what is happening. Their minds may be primitive, operating on basic chemical impulses without the refinement of psychic evolution. Approach with extreme caution. Zephyrian breathed deeply, centering himself as he had been trained to do since childhood. His consciousness expanded, flowing outward like a gentle tide. First, he touched the familiar minds of his colleagues, their thoughts warm and welcoming. Then, he extended further, past the walls of the chamber, beyond the city itself, reaching toward the small human vessel hanging in the darkness above their world. The first thing that struck him was the void. Where he expected to encounter minds, there was nothing. It was like reaching for a star and finding only empty space. But as he pushed deeper, extending his awareness with more force, he began to sense something strange. There were minds there, but they were hidden behind barriers unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was as if each human consciousness was wrapped in layers of chaotic static, walls built not of psychic energy, but of something far more primitive and somehow infinitely more complex. Zephyrian had touched the minds of beings made of pure energy, creatures whose thoughts moved at the speed of light, and ancient entities whose consciousness spanned entire star systems. But this was different. These barriers weren't constructed. They were natural, organic, part of the very fabric of human consciousness itself. Curiosity overrode caution. Zephyrian pushed harder, his enhanced abilities cutting through space to focus on the strongest presence aboard the human vessel. Through the cosmic distance, he could sense a single individual, apparently the leader of their delegation. The human's name filtered through the electromagnetic chatter their primitive technology created, Commander Sarah Chun, representing something called the United Earth Coalition. Zephyrian gathered his power, drawing on the amplification provided by the contact throne. His consciousness became a spear of pure mental energy, carefully controlled and precisely focused. He had done this thousands of times before, gently touching alien minds to establish communication. With delicate skill born of centuries of experience, he reached out and made contact with the human commander's consciousness. The moment his awareness touched her mind, reality exploded. It was like grasping a star with his bare hands, like diving into the heart of a supernova. Sarah Chen's mind wasn't the simple, primitive consciousness he had expected. Instead, it was a roiling ocean of thoughts, emotions, memories, and sensations all crashing together in patterns that defied every law of mental physics Zephyrian understood. Her thoughts moved in impossible directions simultaneously, past, present, and future blurring together in streams of consciousness that folded back on themselves. Memories cascaded through her mind like waterfalls of pure experience. Childhood summers on a planet called Earth, the weight of command responsibility, fear for her crew's safety, wonder at alien contact, tactical assessments, personal doubts, the taste of coffee, the face of someone she loved, mathematical calculations, fragments of music, the texture of her uniform fabric against her skin. But beneath it all, supporting this chaos like a foundation made of storm clouds, was something that made Zephyrian's carefully ordered telepathic training utterly inadequate. Sarah Chen's mind contained multitudes, not just her own consciousness, but shadows of every human she had ever known, genetic memories stretching back through evolutionary history, cultural knowledge passed down through generations, and an emotional spectrum so complex it was like trying to map a star cluster with tools designed to measure pebbles. The worst part wasn't the chaos itself, it was the power behind it. Human consciousness, Zephyrian realized with growing horror, wasn't weak or primitive. It was compressed, condensed into such density that it was like comparing a gentle rain to a hurricane. Where Mentari minds were vast, open spaces connected by streams of shared thought, human minds were pressure-sealed containers holding the force of entire worlds. Zephyrian tried to withdraw, but Sarah Chen's consciousness had somehow latched onto his mental probe. Her mind wasn't passive. It was actively pulling at his awareness, dragging him deeper into the storm of human thought. Through their connection, he could sense her confusion and alarm as she became aware of the alien presence in her head, but her natural mental defenses were responding with savage instinct. Pain lanced through Zephyrian's consciousness as human emotional intensity crashed over him like a tsunami. Sarah Chan was experiencing fear, wonder, protective rage for her crew, scientific curiosity, and tactical alertness all at the same time, each emotion carrying the full force of human neurochemistry behind it. Her mind was throwing everything at the perceived intrusion, not with calculated psychic defense, but with the raw, undisciplined power of millions of years of evolution. Through the connection thrones amplification systems, the backwash of Sarah Chen's mental storm began affecting every telepath in the chamber. Subtelepath Lyrian collapsed first, her precisely ordered consciousness unable to process the chaotic feedback flowing through Zephyrian's link. Then, the others began falling, their mental disciplines crumbling under exposure to thought patterns that operated according to rules they had never encountered. Zephyrian himself was trapped, his awareness being pulled deeper into the labyrinth of human consciousness. He experienced memories that weren't his own. The sensation of breathing oxygen-rich air, the gravitational pull of a world that was mostly water, the complex social dynamics of species that had somehow learned to cooperate despite their individual mental isolation. But with each passing second, more of his own identity was being lost in the maelstrom of Sarah Chen's mind. First speaker Valerian, his ancient consciousness more resilient than the others, managed to maintain enough coherence to act. With desperate strength, he severed the mental connections feeding power to the contact throne, cutting Zephyrian's link to the human commander. The sudden disconnection hit Zephyrian like a physical blow. He convulsed in the throne, his silver eyes rolling back as his consciousness snapped back to his own body with violent force. Around him, the other telepaths lay unconscious or writhing in mental agony, their carefully cultivated psychic abilities scattered like leaves in a hurricane. For several minutes, the Grand Communion Chamber was filled only with the sound of labored breathing and the soft hum of emergency biomonitors. When Zephyrian finally opened his eyes, he found First Speaker Valerian kneeling beside the throne, the ancient telepath's face marked with concern and something else, fear. "What did you encounter?" Valerian asked, his mental voice subdued and careful. Zephyrian tried to organize his thoughts, but fragments of Sarah Chen's consciousness still echoed in his mind like aftershocks from a mental earthquake. "They're not primitive," he whispered, his physical voice hoarse with strain. "They're not weak or undeveloped. They're—" He struggled to find words in any language, telepathic or spoken, that could capture what he had experienced. They're compressed storms of consciousness. Each mind contains the force of an entire civilization, but it's all contained within individual barriers that they can't breach themselves. The implications of this discovery began to sink in as the other telepaths slowly regained consciousness. If humans possessed such raw mental power, but remained isolated within their own minds, what would happen if they ever learned to use their abilities deliberately? What kind of psychic force could a species develop if they combined their technological advancement with that level of natural mental intensity? First Speaker Valorian's ancient features grew grave as he processed Zephyrian's report. "We must contact the human ship immediately," he decided. "If their consciousness is that powerful, our attempt at mental contact may have caused significant trauma to their commander." But even as he spoke, alerts began flashing across the chamber's communication systems. The human vessel was moving, abandoning its stationary position, and accelerating toward their planet with what could only be interpreted as hostile intent. Whatever had happened during the mental contact had apparently convinced the humans that the Mintari posed a direct threat. Zephyrian struggled to his feet, still reeling from his encounter with human consciousness. Through the chamber's viewing portal, he could see the human ship growing larger as it approached, its crude but effective weapons systems powering up. In trying to establish peaceful communication, they had instead triggered what might become the first war between their species. "We need to warn them," he said urgently, though his own mental abilities were too disrupted to attempt another contact. "They don't understand what happened, and we don't understand what they're capable of." As the human ship descended toward New Mentera like a falling star, Zephyrian couldn't shake the feeling that this first contact would change everything. The galaxy's psychic civilizations had built their expansion on the foundation of mental connection and shared consciousness. But humanity represented something entirely different, a species whose minds contain the power to disrupt that entire network, whether they intended to or not. The approaching vessel grew larger in the amber sky, and Zephyrian found himself wondering if the galaxy was ready for the storm that humanity was about to unleash. Based on his brief contact with Sarah Chen's consciousness, he strongly suspected the answer was no. Commander Sarah Chun gripped the armrests of her command chair as the UES Endeavour descended through the alien atmosphere, her knuckles white with tension. The bridge around her hummed with controlled chaos as her crew prepared for what might become humanity's first interstellar conflict. But the external threat was nothing compared to the storm raging inside her own mind. "Commander, are you certain about this approach?" asked Lieutenant Marcus Torres, her tactical officer, his voice carefully neutral despite the concern evident in his dark eyes. The alien city shows no defensive preparations. Their energy signatures suggest civilian infrastructure, not military installations. Sarah's jaw tightened as another wave of phantom sensations washed through her consciousness. Memories that weren't hers, emotions too complex to be human, glimpses of silver-eyed beings moving through crystal corridors. Ever since the incident in her ready room 20 minutes ago, her mind had felt like a battleground where foreign thoughts fought for control against her own identity. She had been reviewing the first contact protocols when it happened. One moment, she was studying the linguistic analysis reports prepared by Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, her xenolinguist, and the next, something vast and alien had invaded her mind with surgical precision. The experience defied description, like having her consciousness forcibly merged with something that thought in colors she couldn't see and felt emotions that had no human equivalent. The attack was telepathic in nature, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her head. "We've encountered our first confirmed psychic species, and their opening move was to violate my mind without permission or warning." She turned to face her bridge crew, noting how they unconsciously shifted to attention when her gaze swept over them. These people trusted her judgment, had followed her through 3 years of deep space exploration. She couldn't let them know how badly the alien contact had shaken her. "Dr. Reeves," Sarah called to the slight, auburn-haired woman hunched over the xenolinguistics console. "What's your assessment of their communication attempts?" Dr. Reeves looked up from her analysis screens, her usually animated features marked with confusion. "That's just it, Commander. There were no communication attempts through any conventional medium. No radio transmissions, no laser communications, no mathematical progressions or pictographic displays. One moment we were receiving standard telemetry data from their planet, and the next." She gestured helplessly. "Whatever happened to you occurred without any detectable electromagnetic interaction." "Which confirms telepathic contact," added Dr. James Wong, the ship's psychologist and neurological specialist. His calm demeanor couldn't quite mask the fascination in his voice. "Commander, I know you're reluctant to discuss the details, but anything you can tell us about the nature of the contact could be crucial for establishing proper first contact protocols." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, trying to organize the chaos in her memory. The alien presence had been unlike anything she could have imagined. Vast, ancient, and utterly foreign, yet somehow carrying an undertone of genuine surprise and curiosity. But beneath that surface layer had been something else, something that had triggered every survival instinct she possessed. "It felt like drowning," she said finally, "like being pulled underwater by something that didn't understand that humans need air to breathe. The alien presence was gentle, I think, but overwhelming, like being touched by a star that doesn't realize how much heat it's generating." The bridge fell silent except for the steady hum of the ship's systems. Sarah could see her crew processing this information, trying to understand the implications of contact with beings who could reach directly into human minds. As military personnel, they were trained to assess threats and respond accordingly. The idea that an enemy could attack their thoughts directly was something no amount of training had prepared them for. "Commander," Lieutenant Torres said carefully, "if they can affect human consciousness directly, our conventional defensive systems are completely inadequate. Energy shields, armor plating, electronic countermeasures. None of it would protect against a telepathic assault. Which is exactly why we're not giving them a chance to launch one, Sarah replied, though her words felt strange coming from her own mouth. Part of her, a part that seemed to be growing stronger since the alien contact, was screaming that this was wrong, that the beings on the planet below meant no harm. But her training and responsibility to her crew demanded that she treat the telepathic intrusion as an act of aggression. The main view screen displayed the alien city growing larger as they descended. New Mentura, according to the initial data packets they had received, was apparently the capital of this world's dominant civilization. The architecture was unlike anything in human experience. Spires of living crystal that seemed to pulse with internal light, connected by bridges that arced through the air without visible support. It was beautiful, Sarah had to admit, but beauty could hide weapons just as easily as ugliness could. Range to primary target? She asked, hating herself even as she spoke the words. The primary target was the largest of the crystal spires. The one their sensors indicated was the source of the most complex energy patterns. If she was going to make a statement about humanity's position on uninvited mental contact, destroying their most important building would certainly communicate the message. 15 kilometers and closing, Torres reported. Weapon systems are fully charged and locked on target. Still no defensive response from the surface. Sarah nodded, but the movement felt mechanical, disconnected from her own will. Another surge of alien memory washed through her consciousness. Silver eyes filled with concern, voices that spoke without sound, carrying urgent warnings about something called a mental cascade. She shook her head violently, tried to dispel the foreign thoughts, but they clung to her awareness like cobwebs. Commander? Dr. Wong had moved to stand beside her chair, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. You're exhibiting signs of significant neurological stress. Elevated heart rate, irregular breathing patterns, involuntary muscle tension. Whatever happened during that contact, it's still affecting you. I'm fine, Doctor, Sarah said automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. Through the viewport, she could see tiny figures moving through the crystal streets below, the aliens going about their daily lives, unaware that a human warship was preparing to rain destruction down on their city. The thought sent a spike of nausea through her stomach, but she couldn't identify whether the revulsion was her own or something left behind by the alien contact. Energy surge detected from the surface, reported inside Katy Park from the sensor station. Multiple sources concentrated around what appears to be a central governmental complex. Power levels are significant, but the energy patterns don't match any weapon signatures in our database. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she realized what was happening. The aliens were preparing for another telepathic assault, probably coordinating their efforts to overcome her defenses. The fact that she couldn't detect the specific nature of their weapons only made them more dangerous. How could humanity defend against attacks that operated outside the normal bounds of physics? All stop, she ordered. Maintain current altitude and prepare for evasive maneuvers. If they're planning another mental attack, I want us ready to break orbit immediately if necessary. But as the Endeavour settled into a hover pattern above the alien city, Sarah became aware of something else. A growing pressure inside her own skull that had nothing to do with the aliens below. The telepathic contact had done something to her mind, opened pathways that were meant to remain closed. She could feel her own thoughts echoing strangely, as if her consciousness was suddenly too large for her skull to contain. Dr. Reeves looked up from her console with obvious excitement, apparently oblivious to the military tension filling the bridge. Commander, I'm detecting structured communication patterns in those energy surges. It's not weapons fire, they're broadcasting. Multiple overlapping signals using what appears to be some form of psychic transmission. Content, Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. Unknown. The signals aren't electromagnetic in nature, so our standard communication equipment can't decode them. But the pattern suggests they're trying to establish a more stable form of contact than whatever happened earlier. Sarah closed her eyes, as another wave of foreign sensation washed through her mind. This time, she didn't fight it quite as hard, allowing herself to experience the alien thoughts without completely losing her own identity in the process. Images flashed through her consciousness, silver-eyed beings in crystalline chambers, their elongated forms radiating concern and confusion. They were trying to communicate, she realized, but their methods were as alien to human experience as breathing water. Through the psychic echo, she could sense their perspective on the earlier contact. The alien telepath, Zephyrian, his name came to her through channels she didn't understand, had been attempting a gentle introduction, the psychic equivalent of extending a hand in greeting. But human consciousness had proven to be unlike anything they had encountered before, a compressed storm of thoughts and emotions that had overwhelmed their carefully controlled mental disciplines. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The aliens hadn't been attacking her mind. They had been trying to say hello, using the only method of communication they understood. And her mental defenses, evolved through millions of years of human survival instincts, had responded to their gentle contact like antibodies attacking a virus. "Commander," Torres's voice cut through her revelation. "I'm detecting multiple aircraft launching from the surface. Speed and trajectory suggest their intercept vectors, ETA approximately 4 minutes." Sarah's eyes snapped open, the bridge coming back in a sharp focus around her. On the main screen, she could see dozens of crystalline vehicles rising from the alien city like a swarm of mechanical insects. Their movements were too smooth, too coordinated to be controlled by individual pilots. They were operating as a collective, she realized, their actions guided by the same telepathic network that connected the alien civilization. "Are they armed?" she asked, her tactical training reasserting itself despite the psychic chaos in her mind. Sensors detect energy generation systems, but no obvious weapon emplacements, Torres reported. However, given their telepathic capabilities, they might not need conventional weapons to pose a threat. Sarah felt her crew's eyes on her, waiting for orders. These people had trusted her to lead them safely through humanity's first contact with alien intelligence. But how could she protect them from beings who could attack their minds directly? How could she make decisions about war and peace when her own thoughts were contaminated by alien memories and emotions? The approaching alien aircraft were beautiful, she had to admit, their crystalline hulls refracting the amber sunlight into prismatic rainbows. But beauty was irrelevant when dealing with potential threats to human survival. If the aliens could coordinate their vessels through telepathic links, they might be capable of similar coordination when attacking human minds. "Charge weapons," she ordered, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "Target the lead formation. If they continue on intercept course, we'll demonstrate that humanity doesn't respond well to mental invasion." But even as she gave the command, Sarah could feel the wrongness of the decision echoing through her consciousness. The alien memories in her mind carried emotional undertones of peace, curiosity, and a desperate desire to prevent the escalation she was about to trigger. Through the psychic connection she didn't understand, she could sense Zephyrian's growing horror as he realized what her military response was going to mean. The crystal aircraft continued their approach, their movements graceful but determined. On her tactical display, Sarah could see weapons locks being established, targeting solutions being calculated. In less than 2 minutes, she would have to decide whether to fire the first shots in an interstellar war or allow alien beings with unknown telepathic capabilities to reach her ship. The pressure in her skull was getting worse, building like steam in an overheated boiler. Her consciousness felt stretched between two realities: the human reality of military protocols and defensive necessity, and the alien reality of mental communion and peaceful contact. Neither perspective was complete without the other, but she couldn't exist in both simultaneously without losing her sanity. "Commander, Dr. Wong said urgently, moving to her side again, "I'm detecting dangerous fluctuations in your neurological activity. Whatever's happening to you, it's accelerating." Sarah nodded grimly, her hands moving to the weapon authorization controls. Whether the approaching aliens meant peace or war, she couldn't allow them to get close enough to repeat their telepathic assault on her crew. Humanity's survival might depend on the decisions she made in the next few minutes, and she couldn't afford to let alien influence cloud her judgment. "All hands, prepare for combat," she announced to the ship's intercom system. "We are about to engage an alien species with confirmed telepathic capabilities. Maintain focus on your duties and report any unusual mental sensations immediately." The alien aircraft were less than a minute away from intercept range when the first human weapons opened fire, their energy beams cutting through the amber atmosphere like spears of concentrated starlight. Below on the surface, Sarah could sense the telepathic network recoiling in shock as they realized that first contact with humanity was about to become something far more violent than anyone had anticipated. The first human energy beam struck the crystalline hull of an approaching Mentari vessel with devastating precision. The elegant craft, designed for peaceful atmospheric travel rather than combat, shattered like a frozen waterfall under the impact. Fragments of living crystal scattered across the amber sky, each piece carrying the death cry of its pilot through the telepathic network that connected every mind on the planet below. Telepath Zephyrian felt the pilot's death as if it were his own, the sudden severing of consciousness hitting the psychic web like a hammer blow. Around him in the emergency coordination chamber, dozens of telepaths cried out in shared agony as the network convulsed with pain and confusion. Never in 3,000 years of civilization had the Mentari experienced the violent death of one of their own during what was supposed to be a peaceful contact mission. "Sever the combat links," First Speaker Valerian commanded, his ancient mind struggling to maintain coherence as waves of panic flooded through the collective consciousness. "Isolate the approaching squadrons before their deaths destroy our ability to coordinate." But it was already too late. The human weapons fired again, and 3 more crystalline aircraft vanished in balls of superheated energy. Each death sent shockwaves through the telepathic network, creating cascading feedback loops that overwhelmed the mental defenses of hundreds of Mentari on the surface. Zephyrian watched in horror as telepaths throughout the city collapsed, their consciousness scattered by the violent psychic trauma of witnessing murder through their mental links. Through the chaos, he could still feel the echo of his connection to the human commander, Sarah Chun. Her mind remained a storm of conflicting thoughts and emotions, but now those feelings included something that made Zephyrian's blood freeze in his veins. Grim satisfaction at the destruction her weapons were causing, mixed with genuine regret that felt too complex to be anything but authentic human emotion. "They're not just attacking," he reported to Valerian, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining his own mental barriers. "The commander is experiencing simultaneous pleasure and pain at our deaths. Her species appears capable of holding contradictory emotions in perfect balance while still acting decisively. He struggled for words to describe what he was sensing. It's like touching the mind of a being who can love and hate the same thing at exactly the same moment." First Speaker Valorian's elongated features grew pale as he processed this information. In Mentari society, such emotional contradiction would be a sign of severe mental illness, a consciousness so damaged that it couldn't maintain basic psychological coherence. But in the human mind, it seemed to be a natural state, allowing them to feel guilt about their actions while still carrying them out with mechanical precision. "Order all craft to retreat," Valerian decided. "We're losing too many pilots to maintain combat coordination. The feedback from their deaths is crippling our ability to respond effectively." But as the surviving Mentari vessels began to pull back, the human ship followed them down through the atmosphere like a predator pursuing wounded prey. More energy beams lanced out, each shot precisely targeted and devastatingly effective. The human weapon systems were crude compared to Mentari technology, but they were operated by minds that could compartmentalize violence without losing tactical effectiveness. Zephyrian felt another connection open in his consciousness as subtelepath Lyrian reached out from her position in the orbital monitoring station. Her mental voice carried desperate urgency as she reported what her sensors were detecting from the human vessel. "The feedback we're experiencing from their commander isn't just affecting us," she transmitted. "Something's happening to the humans as well. I'm detecting massive neurological activity spikes across their entire crew, centered on the command sections of their ship." The implications hit Zephyrian like a physical blow. The telepathic contact hadn't just opened a one-way channel from his mind to Sarah Chan's. It had created a permanent psychic bridge between their species. Every emotion, every thought that passed through the human commander's consciousness was bleeding into the Mentari network. But, more terrifyingly, their own telepathic abilities were somehow being transmitted back to the humans through the same connection. "Valerian," he said urgently, "I think the humans are developing telepathic abilities in real time. The contact I made with their commander has somehow activated latent psychic potential in their entire crew." Before the first speaker could respond, alerts began flashing throughout the chamber. The human ship had descended to less than 500 meters above the city's central spire, close enough that its presence was causing interference with the delicate crystalline structures that formed the backbone of Mentari civilization. But more alarming was what their sensors were detecting from the vessel itself. "Massive psychic energy buildup," reported one of the monitoring telepaths, his voice shaking with disbelief. "Power levels are off our measurement scale. Whatever's happening aboard that ship is generating telepathic force comparable to our entire planetary network." Zephyrian reached out with his enhanced senses, trying to understand what was occurring aboard the human vessel. What he found defied everything he thought he knew about consciousness and psychic ability. The human crew, all 53 individuals, were experiencing simultaneous telepathic awakening. Their minds, which had been completely closed off from psychic contact just hours before, were now blazing with mental energy like newly ignited stars. But unlike the controlled, disciplined telepathy that Mentari children learned over decades of careful training, the humans were experiencing raw, unfiltered psychic contact. Their minds were connecting to each other with the same chaotic intensity that had overwhelmed Zephyrian during his initial contact with Sarah Chun. The result was a feedback loop of human consciousness that was growing exponentially more powerful with each passing minute. Through the psychic bridge that still connected him to the human commander, Zephyrian could experience secondhand what was happening aboard their ship. Sarah Chun was fighting to maintain command authority, even as her mind was being flooded with the thoughts, fears, and memories of her entire crew. She could suddenly hear Lieutenant Torres thinking about his daughter back on Earth, feel Dr. Reeves's scientific excitement at discovering telepathic aliens, experience Dr. Wong's concern for the crew's psychological stability. But the truly terrifying part was how quickly the humans were adapting to their new abilities. Within minutes of the awakening beginning, they were already learning to filter and organize the psychic input, creating crude mental barriers that allowed them to function despite the chaos in their minds. Their consciousness was evolving in real time, developing telepathic skills through pure instinct that took Mentari decades to master through careful study. "They're learning," Zephyrian whispered, awe and terror mixing in his voice. "In less than half an hour, they've developed telepathic abilities equivalent to our intermediate students." At this rate of advancement, he didn't need to finish the thought. Both he and Valerian could sense what was coming. If human consciousness could develop telepathic abilities this rapidly while maintaining their natural mental intensity, they would soon be capable of psychic feats that surpassed anything in Mentari history. The species that had seemed telepathically dead just hours ago might become the most powerful psychic civilization the galaxy had ever seen. Aboard the human vessel, the awakening was accelerating beyond all control. Sarah Chun gripped her command chair as waves of telepathic energy coursed through her consciousness, bringing her into direct mental contact with not just her crew, but with the alien telepaths on the planet below. She could suddenly sensed Zephyrian's mind clearly, understanding his concern and confusion as if they were her own emotions. "Commander," Dr. Wong's voice came to her through both audible speech and direct mental transmission, the dual input creating a surreal harmony of communication. "The neurological changes are spreading to the entire crew. Everyone's exhibiting signs of telepathic activation, but the process is happening too fast for our brains to adapt safely." Sarah nodded, though the gesture felt strange now that she could sense Dr. Wong's thoughts directly. Around her, the bridge crew was struggling to adapt to their new abilities while still maintaining their duties. Lieutenant Torres was experiencing tactical data through both his sensor displays and direct psychic perception of the alien aircraft movements. Dr. Reeves was receiving linguistic information directly from the aliens below, understanding their language not through translation, but through shared meaning transmitted mind to mind. "Status report," Sarah commanded, and was startled to realize that her words had been broadcast telepathically to every human on the ship simultaneously. The efficiency of psychic communication was remarkable, but it was also completely uncontrolled. Private thoughts, personal memories, and individual fears were bleeding freely between crew members, creating an emotional chaos that threatened to overwhelm their ability to function as a military unit. "Weapons systems nominal," Torres reported, his thoughts carrying undertones of guilt at the deaths he had caused and determination to protect his fellow humans. "But, Commander, I'm receiving direct input from the alien pilots we're engaging. I can feel their fear, their confusion. They don't understand why we're attacking them." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the terrible irony of their situation. The telepathic awakening had given them the ability to truly communicate with the aliens for the first time, to understand their peaceful intentions and genuine desire for friendly contact. But it had also made the violence they were committing infinitely more personal, forcing them to experience their enemies' deaths through direct psychic connection. "Maintain defensive posture," she ordered, though the words fell hollow now that she could sense the aliens' true motives through the telepathic link. "We need time to understand what's happening to us before we can make decisions about changing our tactical approach." But time was running out. Through her connection to Zephyrian's mind, Sarah could sense the growing alarm among the alien telepaths as they realized the scope of what was occurring. The humans weren't just developing telepathic abilities, they were developing them at a rate that would soon make them the dominant psychic force in this region of space. The controlled, disciplined telepathic network that had governed Mentari civilization for millennia was about to be overwhelmed by the raw, chaotic power of awakening human consciousness. "Commander," Ensign Park's voice carried through both vocal and telepathic channels, creating an eerie echo effect. "I'm detecting massive energy fluctuations from the planet's surface. Whatever passes for their government down, they're mobilizing everything they have." Sarah closed her eyes and reached out through the psychic connection, her newly awakened abilities allowing her to perceive the alien world in ways that no human had ever experienced before. She could sense the crystalline spires of New Mentera blazing with telepathic activity as thousands of Mentari minds linked together in emergency coordination. Their entire civilization was preparing to defend itself against what they perceived as a psychic invasion of unprecedented scope and power. But she could also sense something else through the connection, an opportunity for understanding that had never existed before. If both species could survive the next few hours without destroying each other, the telepathic bridge between their minds might allow for a level of communication and cooperation that could transform both civilizations forever. The question was whether they could stop fighting long enough to realize what they were on the verge of achieving together. As more alien aircraft approached through the amber sky and her weapons systems tracked their movements with mechanical precision, Sarah Chun found herself standing at the crossroads of either first contact or first war, with the telepathic awakening of humanity hanging in the balance of her next decision. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves pressed her palms against her temples as another wave of alien knowledge flooded her consciousness. Through the telepathic awakening that had transformed every human aboard the Endeavor, she was receiving direct linguistic input from the Mentari civilization below. Not just their words, but the conceptual frameworks underlying their entire system of communication. "Commander," she called out, her voice strained with the effort of processing information through both her academic training and her newly awakened psychic abilities, "I'm receiving complex semantic structures directly from their minds. They're not just trying to communicate, they're trying to share the fundamental principles of their society, their history, their understanding of telepathic ethics." Sarah Chun turned from the main view screen, where she had been watching the approaching alien aircraft, her own mind still reeling from the constant flood of telepathic input. The psychic bridge that connected her to high telepath Zephyrian carried a constant stream of alien thoughts and emotions, making it increasingly difficult to maintain her human perspective on the situation. "What kind of principles?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer through the direct mental connection. Dr. Reeves closed her eyes, allowing herself to fully receive the alien concepts without fighting their strangeness. "Their entire civilization is built on what they call consensual mental communion," she reported. "For 3,000 years, they've never encountered a species that could maintain consciousness while remaining telepathically isolated. To them, our natural mental barriers represent a form of existential impossibility, like beings who could live without breathing air." Through the telepathic link, Sarah could sense Zephyrian's growing comprehension of the vast cultural misunderstanding that had triggered this confrontation. The Mentari approach to first contact had been based on millions of previous encounters with telepathic species, beings whose minds naturally reached out to establish communication through psychic connection. Their initial contact attempt hadn't been an invasion. It had been the equivalent of a polite greeting, as natural to them as a handshake was to humans. But human consciousness, evolved in isolation behind impenetrable mental barriers, had responded to their telepathic greeting with all the defensive intensity of a species that had never experienced psychic contact. The result had been catastrophic for both sides, creating a feedback loop of misunderstanding that was now threatening to escalate into interstellar war. "Lieutenant Torres," Sarah called to her tactical officer, "what's the current status of our weapons systems?" Torres's reply came through both vocal and telepathic channels, the dual transmission creating an unsettling harmony. "All weapon batteries remain charged and targeted. But, Commander," his thoughts carried a weight of moral conflict that his spoken words couldn't convey. "Through the psychic connection, I can feel the fear of the alien pilots we're tracking. They're not approaching us as attackers. They're coming to attempt rescue operations for the crews we've already shot down." Sarah felt her stomach clench as the full implications of this information hit her. Through the telepathic link with Zephyrian, she could sense the desperate grief that was flowing through the Mentari civilization as they mourned their dead. Each of the pilots they had killed had been connected to hundreds of other minds through the psychic network, making their deaths traumatic events that affected entire communities. "Dr. Wong," she called to the ship psychologist, "what's your assessment of our crew's psychological state? Can we maintain operational effectiveness while dealing with these telepathic effects?" Dr. Wong looked up from his monitoring equipment, his features marked with fatigue and concern. "The neurological changes are stabilizing, but the psychological impact is unprecedented. Every crew member is experiencing direct emotional contact with both their colleagues and the alien minds below. We're essentially learning to function as a collective consciousness while maintaining individual identity. The concept would have been impossible to understand just hours ago, but through the telepathic awakening, Sarah could experience it directly. Her mind remained distinctly her own, but it was also connected to the thoughts and emotions of 52 other human beings, plus an unknown number of alien telepaths. The sensation was overwhelming yet oddly natural, as if human consciousness had always been designed for this kind of connection, but had never encountered the proper catalyst to activate it. "Commander," Ensign Park's voice carried urgent concern, "I'm detecting additional energy signatures approaching from orbital positions. Multiple vessels, much larger than the atmospheric craft we've been engaging. Sarah's blood ran cold as she processed this information through both her tactical training and the telepathic connection to the aliens below. Through Zephyrian's mind, she could sense the approaching vessels, Mentari deep space cruisers designed for interstellar travel and equipped with weapons that could destroy her ship with ease. The local government had called for military assistance from their orbital defense network. But the truly terrifying aspect wasn't the approaching firepower. It was what she could sense about the aliens' intentions through the psychic link. They weren't planning to destroy the human ship. Instead, they were preparing to attempt something called a consciousness integration, a telepathic procedure designed to forcibly merge human and Mentari minds into a stable collective entity. "They're not coming to attack us," she announced to her bridge crew, her voice carrying both relief and new fear. "They're coming to save us from ourselves." The Mentari believe that our awakening telepathic abilities are unstable and dangerous, not just to them, but to us. They're planning to intervene by merging our consciousness with their own network. The implications hit her crew like a physical blow. Dr. Wong's face went pale as he understood what such a procedure would mean. "Complete loss of individual human identity," he said quietly. "Our consciousness would be absorbed into their collective, diluted among thousands of alien minds until nothing distinctly human remained." But even as he spoke, Sarah could sense through the telepathic link that the Mentari saw this outcome as humanitarian rather than destructive. To them, individual consciousness trapped behind mental barriers was a form of psychological torture, like being permanently locked in solitary confinement. Their planned intervention was meant to free humanity from what they perceived as a cruel form of mental isolation. "Time until the orbital vessels reach us?" Sarah asked. 17 minutes, Torres reported. "And, Commander, our weapon systems are completely inadequate against ships of that size. They're designed for planetary bombardment and fleet-level combat. We're essentially bringing a knife to a gunfight." Sarah closed her eyes and reached deeper into the telepathic connection, allowing her consciousness to merge more fully with Zephyrian's alien perspective. Through his senses, she experienced the approaching crisis from the Mentari point of view. The urgent need to prevent a telepathic cascade that could destabilize consciousness across multiple star systems, the genuine concern for human welfare despite the violence they had committed, the fear that humanity's chaotic mental awakening could shatter the carefully constructed psychic network that connected dozens of civilizations. But she also sensed something else in Zephyrian's mind, a growing fascination with human consciousness that bordered on scientific obsession. Through their connection, he had experienced the raw power and complexity of human thought in ways that challenged every assumption his species held about the nature of mind and identity. Part of him was beginning to suspect that consciousness integration might not save humanity. It might destroy something unique and precious that the galaxy had never seen before. "There might be another option," Sarah said suddenly, opening her eyes to face her crew. "Through the telepathic link, I can sense that not all of the Mentari agree with the consciousness integration plan. Some of them are fascinated by our ability to maintain individual identity while developing telepathic abilities. If we can establish stable communication before the orbital vessels arrive." "Commander," Dr. Reeves interrupted, excitement evident in both her voice and her telepathic emanations. "I'm receiving direct conceptual input about something they call bridge consciousness, a form of telepathic connection that preserves individual identity while allowing collective communication. It's theoretical in their society, considered too dangerous to attempt, but with human mental barriers." The idea hit Sarah like a revelation. Human consciousness, with its natural resistance to telepathic invasion, might be able to maintain individual identity even while participating in collective telepathic networks. Instead of being absorbed into Mentari civilization, humanity could serve as a stabilizing influence, providing the psychic network with anchor points that prevented the loss of individual perspective. "Dr. Wong," she said urgently. Is it possible for us to establish controlled telepathic communication with the surface? Something that allows information exchange without risking consciousness merger. Dr. Wong consulted his monitoring equipment, his thoughts racing through possibilities. Based on what I'm observing of our crew's adaptation patterns, yes. But it would require precise coordination between human and Mentari telepaths, and there's no guarantee that it wouldn't trigger exactly the kind of cascade they're trying to prevent. Through the connection with Zephyrian, Sarah could sense his growing excitement as he realized what she was proposing. Instead of consciousness integration or continued conflict, they could attempt to create something entirely new, a telepathic bridge that preserved the best aspects of both human and Mentari mental abilities while avoiding the dangers of either complete isolation or complete merger. Lieutenant Torres, Sarah commanded, power down our weapons systems, but maintain defensive shields. I want the approaching alien vessels to know we're willing to attempt peaceful resolution. Commander, Torres's voice carried concern. If this doesn't work, we'll be defenseless against their orbital weapons. If this doesn't work, Sarah replied, weapons won't help us anyway. Our only chance is to prove that human and Mentari consciousness can coexist without either species losing what makes them unique. She settled back into her command chair and closed her eyes, reaching out through the telepathic connection to Zephyrian's mind with deliberate focus. Instead of fighting the alien thoughts that had been flooding her consciousness, she began to organize them, creating mental structures that could hold both human and Mentari perspectives simultaneously without either one overwhelming the other. The process was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of her individual mind while still maintaining her essential humanity. Through the psychic bridge, she could sense Zephyrian matching her efforts from his position in the crystal chamber below, his alien mind learning to accommodate human thought patterns without being destroyed by their chaotic intensity. Around her on the bridge, her crew watched with fascination and terror as their commander attempted to become the first being in galactic history to successfully bridge the gap between isolated human consciousness and the vast telepathic networks that connected the stars. The next few minutes would determine whether first contact between their species led to mutual understanding or the loss of humanity's individual identity forever. In the amber sky above New Mentera, the massive orbital vessels continued their approach, their weapons systems charging in preparation for whatever intervention might be necessary to prevent a telepathic catastrophe that could reshape consciousness across the galaxy. The moment of contact felt like watching the birth of a new kind of star. Commander Sarah Chen's consciousness expanded beyond the confines of her individual mind while somehow remaining distinctly human, creating a bridge between species that had never existed before in the galaxy's history. Through the telepathic connection, she could sense High Telepath Zephyrian's amazement as he experienced human thought patterns that maintained their chaotic intensity while participating in organized collective communication. It's working, Dr. Reeves whispered, her voice filled with scientific wonder as she monitored the unprecedented telepathic exchange. The bridge consciousness is stable. Both human and Mentari thought patterns are remaining distinct while sharing information freely. Around the bridge of the Endeavor, the crew watched in fascination as their commander pioneered a new form of existence. Sarah's mind had become a living embassy between species, translating concepts that had no equivalent between human and alien consciousness while preserving the essential nature of both forms of thought. Through the bridge, Sarah could sense the massive orbital vessels slowing their approach as the Mentari military commanders received real-time reports of what was occurring. The consciousness integration they had planned was no longer necessary. Something far more remarkable was taking place. Humanity was maintaining its individual identity while participating in telepathic communion, creating possibilities that challenged every assumption about the nature of mind and communication. Commander, Lieutenant Torres reported, his own thoughts now colored with alien concepts that were filtering through the expanding bridge consciousness. The approaching vessels are requesting permission to establish closer monitoring positions. They want to study what you're achieving with their telepath. Sarah nodded, though the gesture felt strange now that she could communicate more efficiently through direct thought transmission. "Grant permission," she said, her words carrying undertones of meaning that could only be conveyed through telepathic contact. "But maintain defensive protocols. We're walking into uncharted territory here." The sensation of bridging two forms of consciousness was unlike anything that could be described in merely human terms. Sarah's mind contained multitudes, her own thoughts and memories, plus echoes of Zephyrian's vast alien perspective, and through him, traces of the entire Mentari civilization. Yet instead of being overwhelmed or absorbed, her human identity was becoming stronger, more defined by contrast with the alien thoughts surrounding it. Through Zephyrian's senses, she could experience the crystal spires of New Mentera from within, understanding how the Mentari had built their entire civilization around principles of mental harmony and collective decision-making. Their society was a work of art constructed from shared consciousness, with every individual contributing to patterns of thought that span generations. But she could also sense their limitations, the way their emphasis on mental unity sometimes suppressed individual innovation and creative chaos. "The integration is expanding," Dr. Wong reported, monitoring neurological data from across the ship. "The bridge consciousness effect is beginning to include other crew members. But it's not overwhelming them. They're maintaining individual identity while gaining access to collective information processing." Sarah could feel it happening, her bridge with Zephyrian becoming a focal point that connected not just human and alien minds, but different ways of thinking about consciousness itself. Her crew was learning to access Mentari knowledge directly while contributing their own perspectives to the growing network. The result was a hybrid form of telepathic communication that combined human creativity with alien wisdom. Through the expanding connection, she sensed the approach of First Speaker Valorian's consciousness, the ancient Mentari leader carefully extending his awareness to touch the unprecedented bridge between species. His mental voice carried wonder and caution in equal measure as he experienced human thought patterns for the first time. Commander Chun, his telepathic communication somehow carried the formal tones of diplomatic protocol, despite being transmitted directly from mind to mind. "What you have achieved challenges our fundamental understanding of consciousness. Your species maintains individual identity while participating in collective awareness, something we believe to be theoretically impossible." Sarah found herself responding through multiple channels simultaneously, her thoughts reaching Valerian both through her own newly developed telepathic abilities and through Zephyrian's established connection to the Mentari network. "Our minds evolved differently," she replied, the communication carrying depths of meaning that spoken language could never convey. "We developed behind barriers that forced us to compress vast amounts of consciousness into individual units. But we're not naturally limited to individual existence. We just never had the opportunity to connect with other minds before." The implications of this revelation were staggering. As more human crew members joined the bridge consciousness, their collective problem-solving abilities began to demonstrate capabilities that surpassed anything either species had achieved alone. Human creativity and adaptability merged with Mentari telepathic discipline created hybrid thoughts that approached problems from angles neither species would have considered independently. "Commander," Ensign Park's voice carried excitement that was amplified through the telepathic connection. "I'm detecting similar effects beginning to occur among the alien population below. Some of the Mentari are learning to maintain individual perspective while participating in collective awareness. It's like our consciousness bridge is teaching both species new ways to think." Through Zephyrian's connection to the planetary network, Sarah could sense the growing excitement among Mentari scientists and philosophers as they realized the scope of what was occurring. The bridge consciousness wasn't just allowing communication between human and alien minds. It was evolving both forms of consciousness into something entirely new. Humans were learning telepathic communion while maintaining their chaotic creativity, while Mentari were discovering individual perspective without losing their collective wisdom. The orbital vessels are requesting permission to dock, Torres reported. They want to establish direct contact with our bridge consciousness to better understand its potential applications. Sarah considered the request through both human caution and alien curiosity, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. Allowing direct physical contact between the species would make the telepathic bridge more stable and powerful, but it would also create permanent changes that could never be reversed. Humanity would be forever connected to the galactic telepathic network, gaining access to the knowledge and perspectives of dozens of civilizations while contributing their own unique viewpoint to the collective. Dr. Wong, she asked, what's your assessment of our crew's psychological stability? Can we handle sustained contact with alien consciousness without losing our essential humanity? Dr. Wong studied his monitoring equipment, his thoughts flowing through both analytical processes and intuitive understanding enhanced by the bridge connection. The crew is not just maintaining stability, they're thriving. The bridge consciousness appears to strengthen individual identity by providing contrast with other perspectives. We're becoming more human by understanding what makes us different from other species. The realization struck Sarah with the force of revelation. This was what humanity had been unconsciously preparing for throughout their entire evolutionary history. Their isolation behind mental barriers hadn't been a limitation. It had been a form of psychological pressure cooking that had created minds dense enough to maintain individual identity even while participating in collective consciousness. They were naturally suited to serve as anchor points in telepathic networks, providing stability and individual perspective that prevented collective consciousness from losing touch with personal experience. Grant docking permission to the lead orbital vessel, Sarah decided, but maintain our independence. We're establishing partnership, not surrender. As the massive Mentari ship approached the Endeavor, Sarah could sense the excitement flowing through both human and alien crews. They were about to become the first beings in galactic history to achieve true symbiotic consciousness, minds that remained individual while sharing collective awareness, preserving the best aspects of both isolated and connected forms of thought. The docking process itself became a ceremony of connection. As the two ships joined, the bridge consciousness expanded to include the alien crew, creating a network of minds that spanned species while preserving the unique characteristics that made each consciousness valuable. Human chaos merged with Mentari order to create something that was somehow more stable and more creative than either could achieve alone. Through the expanded network, Sarah could sense the reactions from across the galaxy as news of the bridge consciousness spread through the telepathic web that connected dozens of civilizations. Species that had never imagined alternative forms of awareness were suddenly fascinated by the possibilities that human consciousness represented. The isolated individual minds that had seemed primitive and disabled were being recognized as the key to evolving collective consciousness beyond its current limitations. Commander, Dr. Reeves said, her scientific excitement now amplified by direct access to alien knowledge through the bridge network. I'm receiving communication from civilizations across the galaxy. They're requesting permission to establish bridge consciousness connections with human representatives. Our species is being invited to serve as consciousness ambassadors to telepathic civilizations that have never experienced individual perspective. Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of responsibility and opportunity settling on her shoulders. Humanity had discovered their place in the galactic community not as junior partners learning telepathic abilities, but as essential contributors to the evolution of consciousness itself. Their chaotic, isolated minds were exactly what telepathic civilizations needed to prevent stagnation and maintain individual creativity within collective awareness. Prepare messages for Earth Command, she ordered, her thoughts reaching her crew through both spoken words and telepathic transmission. Tell them that first contact was successful, but that humanity is about to become something far more than we ever imagined possible. Through the bridge consciousness, she could sense the future spreading out before them like a vast network of possibilities. Human colonies would be established not as isolated outposts, but as living bridges between individual and collective consciousness, allowing telepathic civilizations to maintain both unity and diversity. Humans would become the connective tissue of galactic civilization, their unique minds serving as stable anchor points that prevented collective consciousness from losing touch with individual experience. The galaxy was about to discover that consciousness isolation wasn't a disability. It was an evolutionary adaptation that had created minds capable of bridging the gap between individual creativity and collective wisdom. And humanity, the species that had seemed telepathically primitive just hours ago, was about to become the most important force in the continued evolution of galactic consciousness. As the bridge consciousness continued to expand, incorporating minds from both species into a network that preserved individual identity while enabling collective thought, Sarah Chun realized that they had achieved something far more significant than first contact. They had discovered humanity's true purpose in the universe, to serve as bridges between forms of consciousness that had never been able to connect before, creating possibilities for awareness and cooperation that no single species could achieve alone. The telepathic awakening that had begun with violence and misunderstanding had evolved into something that would transform the nature of consciousness across the galaxy, with humanity serving as both catalyst and guardian of individual identity within the growing web of connected minds.